This is Government Matters, the show that delivers insights on federal government programs, people, and operations. I'm Mimi Geerges. It has been a big year for the national security community, but we want to start with one of the most recent developments. Brittney Griner was released from Russian custody in exchange for Victor Bout, a Russian arms dealer who was serving a 25-year prison sentence for conspiring to kill Americans. John Kirby is the National Security Coordinator for Strategic Communications at the White House. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you, Mimi.
The exchange was a long time in coming. You first talked about it over the summer.
Yes.
What was the key to finally making it happen?
It was a painstaking set of negotiations and work with our Russian interlocutors over the last few weeks and months. It really kind of came to closure 2 weeks ago when it was clear that the only deal that was possible in that moment was to trade Mr. Bout for Brittney Griner. The president made that decision. It was not a decision he took lightly. Made that decision to go ahead and execute the deal, and then recent days, prior to that, or I'm sorry, subsequent to that, we were able to work through the logistics with the Russians to make the exchange.
The administration has received a lot of criticism for leaving American Paul Whelan behind. How do you respond to that criticism?
We want Paul home just as much as his family wants him home. And I can tell you that right up until the moment that the president decided to execute the deal, Bout for Griner, we were still in that moment trying to see if we could maneuver a way to get Paul out too, to get both of them out. The problem, Mimi, is that the Russians treat Mr. Whelan differently. They levied some sham espionage charges against him. They put him in a different category than what they would consider other criminals. And so there just was no way to get both of them out for Mr. Bout. But over these last weeks and months, we've learned a lot about the Russian position. We've learned a lot about how specially they sort of categorize Mr. Whelan. So that gives us context and information to try to pursue these negotiations, hopefully in a more fruitful way going forward. And those negotiations are ongoing.
They want a spy for a spy. So do you have a Russian spy that you can give back?
What I can tell you is we do not have in our hands and in our ability right now the opportunity to provide an exchange that would be acceptable to the Russians right now. But as I said, we've learned a lot over the last few weeks and months. And that will help inform our process going forward. We'll do the best we can to get him home just as fast as we can.
Victor Bout has been called the merchant of death. He's a free man now. Is he posing a threat to the security of Americans?
Just like with any prisoner exchange, we do a national security assessment across the national security team to assess what the risks might be. That was done in this case, and I can tell you that we're comfortable that we can manage whatever risk might evolve. I want to make a couple of points. He was not serving a life sentence. He was going to go free in 2029, so it's 6 years earlier, but he was going to be a free man. Number two, if he decides when he gets back home that he wants to sort of ply his old trade again, then the United States will be vigilant. We'll be watching for that, and we will not shy away from holding him accountable and protecting our national security interests.
The State Department takes the lead on freeing detained Americans overseas. What is the national security's role in that?
The chief interlocutor for us was the special envoy for hostage affairs, Mr. Roger Carstens, and he and his team did a fantastic job. They really drove the deal going forward. But, as you might imagine, there's a team behind the team, if you will, and the National Security Council was also involved in helping provide some context, provide some guidance, provide some assistance as needed. But it really was the special envoy's job to do this, and that's why we have a special envoy for hostage affairs. And Mr. Carstens, obviously everybody's focused on this particular exchange, rightly so, but he's working on a number of others that we're trying to get, released.
I want to pivot now to Ukraine. You were at the Pentagon when Russia invaded Ukraine in February. The conventional wisdom at that point was Kyiv would fall in a matter of days. That didn't happen. When was it that you realized this is going to be a long fight?
I don't know that there was one moment where we looked and said, oh, geez, we're in this thing for months. But you're right. A lot of people thought that the Ukrainians would not be able to hold out for very long against an onslaught of a vastly superior, at least in numbers, Russian troops, Russian forces that Mr. Putin had amassed along the border all through last fall and early winter. And they surprised everybody. Certainly they surprised the Russians. And what we're focused on is making sure that they can continue to win back their territory and defend their sovereignty. I'll tell you this, the fact that the Ukrainians have done so well is absolutely a testament to their courage and bravery and their own skill. No question about it. But it is important to remember not just the security assistance that they've received before and after the invasion, but the training that the United States and the British and the Canadians and so many other of our NATO allies were providing since 2014. I mean, so that military really transformed into something completely different. It had been a very post-Soviet, Russian-aligned sort of military. But after 2014, after the first Russian invasion in Ukraine, Western nations really took them to the field and taught them different tactics, different procedures, different organizational capabilities that they are executing to a fairly well on the battlefield now. A good example, the Ukrainian army now has a non-commissioned officer corps, which is something that they didn't have before, and the Russians still don't have. And they also have learned to delegate authority down the chain of command. So now you have relatively junior Ukrainian soldiers in the field making very big decisions and know that they have the backup from their chain of command to do that. It's given them more initiative, more speed, more agility. It's made a big difference.
All right, John, stand by. We'll continue talking about Ukraine and some other stuff. I'm back with John Kirby. He's the National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications at the White House. John, Ukraine has been asking for long-range weapons for months. What's been the holdup? Why the piecemeal in, giving certain types of weapons as this war unfolds?
From the very beginning of the war, we have tried to match the kinds of capabilities that the Ukrainians need the most in the moment. When the war first started, earlier we were talking about the Battle of Kyiv. What was really important was Javelin anti-tank missiles, because that's what the Russians were moving into Kyiv. Yes, there were airstrikes, but it was a ground mass artillery and armored movement. And so Javelin anti-tank missiles were really the need that they had. Over time, that changed. When the fighting really started to pick up in the Donbass and in the south, then artillery became the key need by the Ukrainians, what we would call in the military long-range fires. So we sent in howitzers, and we sent in these HIMARS, these advanced rocket systems, highly mobile advanced rocket systems. And now you see that Mr. Putin has really shifted his whole focus to civilian infrastructure and civilian targets, and the use of Iranian drones, which he did not have early in the war, and now cruise missiles, which he has used throughout the war. So air defense has become now sort of the chief need, the big requirement by the Ukrainian armed forces. And air defense it's important to remember, air defense is a layered, contextual sort of defensive system. You need short range, you need medium range, and yes, you need some long range. And so we have been working with our allies and partners to provide a mix of air defense capabilities to the Ukrainians, commensurate with the needs that they have right now. War rarely ever stays the same, no matter where it is and under what circumstances. And so we want to make sure that we are trying to meet Ukrainian needs in near real time so that they can continue to succeed on the battlefield. And that requires changing the capabilities that we provide them.
When you say succeeding on the battlefield, you're talking about defensive weapons. What about offensive weapons?
Well, many of the weapons can be used for both purposes. But what we're focused on, broadly speaking, is making sure that Ukraine can succeed on the battlefield, that they can continue to regain and retain their lost territory from the Russians inside Ukraine. We want to make sure that their sovereignty can be defended and protected and won back, and that's the focus of the systems we're giving them. You
mentioned the Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure. A lot of energy infrastructure has gone down, and it's winter time. How can the U.S. support Ukraine through this time?
We are working very hard to do exactly that. The Secretary of State announced a few weeks ago more than $50 billion worth of assistance, $50 million worth of assistance that can help rebuild some of their energy infrastructure, some equipment, technical assistance, and that kind of thing. And we are already delivering a lot of that material into Ukraine. And it's not just us, Mimi. It's other nations that are doing the same thing, that they are providing equipment, infrastructure, transformers, and again, trying to help connect Ukraine to grids outside Ukraine to keep the lights on, to keep the water running. It's going to be a long, cold winter. This is Mr. Putin's attempt to bring the Ukrainian people to their knees. He's, as the Secretary General of NATO quite, I think, aptly put it, he's weaponizing winter. And so we're doing everything we can, not only to get equipment to Ukraine, but to make sure our allies and partners who may have equipment that is better suited to the Ukrainian network, to get that in there. But also, back to your earlier question about air defense, it's not just enough to give them the equipment, because it could still come under attack by the Russians. We got to make sure that they can defend against those attacks.
I want to ask you about China. In competing with China, the national security strategy says that we're at an inflection point, and that, quote, the next 10 years will be the decisive decade. What needs to happen during this decisive decade that we're not doing right now?
Well, we are doing a lot, quite frankly, because we recognize that it is a decisive decade. We recognize that the growing influence that China is trying to exude, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world, Africa, Latin America, Middle East. We are working, number one, to revitalize our vast network of alliances and partnerships. That is something the Chinese don't have, and they know they don't have it. They don't have the network of allies and partners that we do. And we are putting a lot of energy. President Biden has really put a focus, a priority on making sure that we work with allies and partners, that we listen to allies and partners, and that we contribute more capabilities to those allies and partners. If you look at the National Defense Strategy that the Pentagon just put out and the National Security Strategy that President Biden just put out, you'll see there is a very keen focus on the China challenge. We want to make sure, we're calling it a strategic competition, that we can compete economically, certainly, but yes, absolutely from a security perspective. And so we're putting more capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. We're revitalizing allies and partnerships. We've recently held an Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C., more than almost 50 heads of state from the continent here to meet with the president. China was on the agenda, absolutely, and the challenge that China poses on the continent. So we're working across the spectrum of military and diplomatic and political and economic capabilities.
I want to ask you about what surprised you the most about how 2022 actually played out.
You know, anytime you start a year, and we're about to start a new one, it's difficult to know what you're going to end up facing. I think 22 certainly presented many national security challenges, but also a whole heck of a lot of national security opportunities. If you look at just what was on the president's agenda over the course of the last year, an ASEAN summit that he hosted, going to the G7 and laying out a program for investment around the world, the G20 in Bali, the bilateral meeting he had with President Xi, coming back here to Washington, D.C., holding an Africa Leaders Summit. I mean, if you just look at 2022, what I think you'll see is this president and this administration really prioritizing the United States footing, United States leadership on the world stage.
All right, John, thanks so much for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.